The part of every breakthrough that nobody documents is the part that actually caused it. Before the business turned around, before the relationship was repaired, before the career finally moved forward, something quieter happened first. Something internal. Something that did not make it into the highlight reel or the polished summary of how things changed. The hours just before sleep are not empty hours. They are, according to a significant body of research on memory consolidation and cognitive processing, among the most influential hours of the entire day, not because of what you are doing during them, but because of what the brain tends to do with them afterward. What you think about as you fall asleep, what you rehearse mentally in those final quiet minutes, what emotional and cognitive state you carry into the transition from wakefulness to rest. These inputs do not simply disappear when consciousness fades. Research suggests they get processed, consolidated, and integrated into the neural patterns that shape how you function the following day. This is not a new observation. It has been described and studied across decades of research on how the sleeping brain processes material from the waking one. But it remains one of the most consistently underutilized insights available to anyone working on sustained personal development, mental resilience, or deliberate self-improvement. The practical question is worth asking directly. If the pre-sleep period may genuinely influence how the mind consolidates and organizes what it has been fed, what specifically tends to belong in that period? What kind of thinking, what kind of orientation, what kind of mental content is most likely to support the kind of cognitive and psychological development that accumulates over time? That is what this session explores. Not through absolute claims or guaranteed outcomes. Through a structured, grounded examination of the specific mental orientations and cognitive practices that research and documented experience tend to associate with increasing psychological resilience, clearer thinking, and the kind of inner stability that holds up more reliably under the ordinary pressures of daily life. Part 1. Why the mind before sleep may be more receptive than most people recognize. There is a specific neurological reason why the pre-sleep period is worth paying attention to in the overall architecture of mental development. During the transition from wakefulness to sleep, the phase researchers call hypnagogia, the brain shifts from the high-frequency, high-activity states associated with active conscious thought towards slower, more integrative states. In these slower states, the brain begins a process that researchers have studied extensively, the consolidation of experience into longer-term memory and the integration of new material with existing cognitive structures. This consolidation process continues through the night, particularly during the deep sleep and REM phases that follow. And the material that tends to enter consolidation is not randomly selected. Research suggests it is weighted, in part, by what was most recently and most vividly present in conscious awareness before sleep began. This is the mechanism behind what researchers sometimes call the sleep-dependent memory consolidation effect, and it has a direct practical implication worth considering. The mental content you are most engaged with in the final period before sleep may be disproportionately likely to be processed and integrated during the consolidation that follows. Which means that deliberately choosing that content, rather than letting it default to whatever the day happened to leave behind, is potentially a meaningful form of investment in the cognitive development that occurs during sleep. Most people do not approach it that way. Most people end the day by consuming whatever content happens to be available, and carry whatever residual emotional and cognitive material that content produces into the pre-sleep period. That material then becomes a primary input for the consolidation process. Not chosen, not directed, simply whatever arrived last. The alternative is not complicated. It is simply deliberate, giving more conscious attention to the specific cognitive orientation that characterizes the pre-sleep period is one of the more accessible and consistently underutilized approaches in any serious long-term development practice. What follows are the specific orientations that tend to be worth bringing into that period. Part 2. The practice of definite direction before rest. One of the more consistent findings across documented accounts of sustained personal and professional development is the role of clarity, specifically clarity about direction. Not the vague awareness that things should improve, not the general desire for a better situation, but a specific, articulable sense of what is being worked toward, why it matters, and what the next concrete step in that direction looks like. Clarity of this kind may serve a specific cognitive function worth understanding. When the mind is given a clear, specific direction before sleep, when the last conscious engagement is with a well-defined aim rather than with scattered impressions from the day, it tends to organize its processing activity around that direction to some degree. Problems related to the aim may receive more integrative attention during consolidation. Connections relevant to the aim may be more readily noticed and reinforced. This may help explain why many people working on complex problems report that clearer orientations toward solutions sometimes present themselves in the morning, after a night during which the problem was clearly defined before sleep. This is not a guaranteed outcome, and individual experiences vary, but it is a pattern consistent with what the research on sleep-dependent problem processing suggests. The pre-sleep practice here is specific. Before closing your eyes, spend a few minutes with a clearly stated aim. Not a wish, not a hope, a specific direction, stated as concretely as possible. What are you working toward? What is the next step that serves that direction? What does progress in that direction look like, specifically? Hold that in attention as sleep approaches. Not with urgency or tension, with the calm clarity of someone who knows where they are going and is committed to the process of getting there one day at a time. Over time, repeated consistently, this approach tends to be associated with a sharper and more actionable relationship with the goals being pursued. The results are gradual and individual experiences will vary, but the directional investment is worth making. Part 3. Releasing the weight of the day without losing its lessons. There is a specific cognitive practice that tends to distinguish people who recover more effectively from daily stress and difficulty from those who carry the accumulation of that stress forward into the next day. That practice is the deliberate review and release of the day's events before sleep. Not rumination. Rumination, the repetitive, unresolved cycling through distressing events without productive processing, is associated in research with reduced sleep quality, elevated stress responses, and a gradual erosion of psychological resilience over time. That is not what this practice involves. What it involves instead is a brief, structured review of the day, not to relive it emotionally, but to extract what may be useful from it and consciously set aside what is not. The structure is simple and takes only a few minutes. First, identify what specifically happened today that is worth carrying forward. Not what felt good or bad in an emotional sense, but what produced genuinely useful information, what worked, what did not, and what that suggests about what to approach differently tomorrow. This part of the review is analytical rather than emotional. It treats the day as data rather than as experience to be relived. Second, identify what can reasonably be set aside. Every day tends to produce material that serves limited productive purpose if carried into the next one. Unresolved frustrations that cannot currently be acted on, concerns about outcomes outside current control. These are worth naming specifically and consciously deciding to set aside, rather than carrying them passively into the pre-sleep period. Third, identify one thing from the day that represented forward movement, however small. This is not forced positivity. It is an accurate accounting practice. Progress in any sustained development effort tends to be incremental and therefore easy to overlook in the moment. The deliberate identification of specific forward movement, however modest, helps maintain a more accurate internal record of development over time. This three-part review, conducted calmly and briefly before sleep, tends to produce two outcomes in practice. In the immediate term, it may reduce the cognitive and emotional load carried into the pre-sleep period, which is associated with better sleep quality and research on pre-sleep cognitive activity. In the longer term, practiced consistently, it tends to develop the analytical habit of treating daily experience as information, a habit associated with improving decision-making and psychological resilience over time. Part 4. Building mental resilience through quiet rehearsal. Mental resilience, the capacity to maintain effective functioning under conditions of pressure, uncertainty, and difficulty, is not a fixed trait. It is a developed capacity. And like most developed capacities, it tends to respond to the quality and consistency of the practice directed toward it. One of the less obvious but reasonably well-supported practices for developing this capacity is mental rehearsal, the deliberate, specific imagining of how challenges might be met before they are actually encountered. This practice has a recognized basis in performance research. Studies on mental rehearsal, originally developed in athletic training and later applied across professional and developmental domains, have consistently suggested that the brain's preparation for an activity is not entirely different whether the practice is physical or mental. The cognitive preparation that occurs during deliberate mental rehearsal may contribute meaningfully to how the rehearsed activity is actually performed. Results vary by individual and context, and mental rehearsal is not a substitute for actual practice, but the supporting evidence is substantial enough to make the practice worth incorporating. The pre-sleep period tends to be well suited to this practice. In the calm, low-distraction environment of the pre-sleep state, with the day's active demands no longer competing for attention, the mind is often more capable of the quality of focused mental rehearsal that is harder to sustain during the busier parts of the day. The practice itself is specific. Identify one challenge or demanding situation that is likely to be encountered in the period ahead. It does not need to be dramatic. It can be an ordinary professional challenge, a difficult conversation, or a situation that has previously produced an unproductive response. Then, calmly and specifically, rehearse the response you intend to bring to that situation, not the response that past habit or past stress might produce. The response that reflects the person you are deliberately working to become. Clear-headed, measured, focused on what is within control. Hold that rehearsed response in attention with enough specificity that it feels concrete rather than abstract. Over time, this practice tends to build a set of more considered, preformed responses to the kinds of situations that most commonly produce reactive behavior. It may reduce the cognitive distance between intended and actual behavior in difficult moments. And it uses the consolidation process of sleep as a potential reinforcement mechanism, making those preformed responses more accessible when the real situation arrives. This is mental rehearsal as a specific cognitive development practice, one that may compound, over consistent repetition, into a more reliable capacity to function effectively under pressure. Part 5. The accumulated effect of consistent internal investment. Everything discussed in this session shares a common characteristic. Each practice is modest in its immediate impact. A few minutes of directed thinking before sleep does not change anything in a single night. A structured daily review does not resolve a long-standing challenge on the first occasion it is applied. A single session of mental rehearsal does not permanently alter behavioral responses to difficulty. What these practices may do, however, is something more significant than immediate change. They tend to accumulate. Accumulation, in the context of cognitive and psychological development, operates on the same principle as compounding in any sustained effort. Small, consistent investments in a specific direction tend to produce effects over time that bear no obvious relationship to the size of any individual investment. A person who enters sleep each night with a clear direction held in mind, who reviews the day analytically rather than emotionally, who uses the pre-sleep period for genuine mental rehearsal of the responses they are working to develop, that person, over an extended period of consistent practice, is likely to notice gradual but real shifts in how they process experience, approach difficulty, and maintain direction under pressure. The difference is not visible in any single night. It tends to accumulate gradually. In the architecture of how the mind processes experience and how quickly it recovers from the setbacks that every sustained development effort produces. This is the principle that serious long-term personal development tends to rest on. Not the dramatic single intervention, not the transformation in a moment. The consistent, directed, daily investment in the specific cognitive and psychological qualities that tend to produce someone capable of sustaining effort through difficulty and maintaining direction through uncertainty. The pre-sleep period, used more deliberately, is one of the more accessible points in the daily structure at which that kind of investment can be made. Part 6. What you carry into sleep may influence what you carry out of it. The mind does not rest during sleep in the way the body does. The body recovers. The mind processes. It sorts, consolidates, and integrates the material it has been given. It is, in the hours of sleep, doing some of its most consequential cognitive work that the waking mind benefits from without being fully aware of how it occurred. What that work tends to produce depends substantially on what the mind was given to work with. A mind given clarity, direction, and the deliberate rehearsal of its intended responses may process and reinforce those inputs more effectively. A mind given the residual noise of an unreviewed day may process and reinforce that instead. This is not a complicated insight, but it is one that most approaches to personal development tend to underemphasize, perhaps because the practice it implies is quiet, undramatic, and produces effects that accumulate slowly enough to be easy to underestimate. The practices outlined in this session are not demanding. They do not require exceptional discipline or unusual time commitment. They require only the consistent decision, in the final minutes before sleep, to give the mind something worth working with. A clear direction, an analytical review of the day, a specific rehearsal of the response that difficulty deserves. Night after night, these inputs may accumulate into something that shows up gradually as slightly greater clarity, slightly more stable responses to pressure, and a slightly more reliable capacity to meet the day's demands from a position of groundedness rather than reactivity. And gradually, over enough nights, tends to become significantly. That is the process this session is designed to support, not to guarantee an outcome, but to point toward a practice that the available evidence suggests is worth taking seriously. Let this be the beginning of that practice.